Hi folks, I'm Geek here. Unfortunately, we didn't have the microphone on for apparently about the first 5 minutes of this, but about the 5-minute, 6-second mark, we should start getting audio. Sorry for the technical problems.
Sorry about that. Are we good now? Yeah. Sorry about that, guys. All right, so Malware Pipeline, we've got a feed of malicious files coming in. We're going to perform a series of operations on it and have some sort of output at the end of it. And we'll get into what that output is in just a second. So in the notes, I think in the notes on this talk, I said that I would use a little bit of Docker in there. So, but why did I throw that in there? Was it just to play buzzword bingo and throw in something else that's, you know, hot and new now? Partially, I'll admit that. But also, I teach a class on Docker, and there's actually a good reason for it to fit into this particular talk. Pipelines and big data in general, the big problem is lumpiness of the processing. So you get spikes, you get delays, some processes die out. Things just aren't really predictable. Container technology is really old. As early as 2006, when Google introduced their Linux container technology. These are portable, repeatable units of code. So the big advantage of it, and we're going to use a lot of Docker examples here. The advantage of Docker is that I can wrap up pieces of my pipeline in a container and have it run over my flood of information. And then if they die, I throw it away, I pull another one up. I'll give you an example of that later. Has anybody here worked in Docker? Yeah. No? Some? Maybe. Another really good advantage of Docker is there's a lot of utilities that are already out there, prepackaged, that you can just pull down and start using now. A lot of the failures I ran into when I set up this pipeline was trying to set every piece of it up by hand. So, some of the products of a malware pipeline. I mentioned that threat intelligence was where all this was born, and we started getting into that at the Global Threat Intelligence Department at McAfee. So, what are the products of a malware pipeline, and why would you want to set one up? Well, the very first reason is to provide analysts some seed data to begin their investigations. Malware is usually, when you think of malware analysis, you're probably thinking of IDA Pro, right? It's or a disassembler and a clean environment that you're disassembling one piece of malware at a time, and you're combing through it, looking for its, mining its valuable bits out of. And those are great. We still need that. We're never going to get away from that. We need analysts to go through and figure out the real intricate details of something like, the name escapes me now, but the really good viruses that have come out. Stuxnet, there you go, thank you. Sorry, just drew a blank on that for some reason. But we're always going to need manual malware analysis to pull out secrets like that. But pipelines let us do that in bulk. I don't know if you've seen the statistics, but there's hundreds of thousands of new binaries that are put out every day. Now, we're not going to have, we can't scale our manual analysis to fit that. So we have to do something automated. That's where malware pipelines come in. So provide seed data for the analyst, and we also want to look at modeling the relationship between the threats. So one of the biggest targets for malware analysis is to pull out what servers does this malware talk to. That is the bread and butter of malware analysis. What we want to find out are what are called the command and control servers. That's what the malware, this talk is on the blue track, but it actually is kind of on the red too, but red team as far as malware analysis. This is a cat and mouse game. We want to find out what the malware writers are using for their command and control servers. We want to basically find all of their secrets out. They want to hide that. So part of this is to bring about all those relationships. Second part is to train predictive models. There's a hot trend in threat intelligence now of throwing around machine learning. In fact, this talk, earlier versions of it included a whole other section on machine learning. I cut that out because I think it kind of expanded too far on the talk. But a malware pipeline is what provides all of the data for you to do machine learning afterwards. And then the machine learning generates models that you use to protect networks or to predict or to do whatever else. Jason mentioned spam, asking for spam early on, and then some random guy keeps sending him spam. Well, malware is along the same lines. We need lots of malware in order to cluster it and group it and say these sets of binaries that we see are all similar, or these aren't. Well, pipelines give us the data to do that. Another output of a pipeline is to generate rules for automated protection systems. How many of you are familiar with Snort or Yara? A pipeline, one of the easy wins here is to generate rules based off of your automated analysis. Less frequently, though we have seen it, is to use a malware pipeline to help you figure out how to build better malware. Now, we're at a Christian university and we're not supposed to talk about this, but this can be used for offensive attacks as well, where you learn from what other people have done and you incorporate what they've done into your offensive capabilities in the future. And finally, it's fun. It provides lulls. I've seen some interesting things malware authors have tried to get away with. And there's also, like I said, this cat and mouse game. So many of you have probably, or you may have seen in some malware analysis where there's messages that are passed back and forth in the code between the malware authors and the people who are trying to analyze it. That shows up in malware analysis, and it can actually be kind of funny, the back and forth. For example, there's one piece of malware that I had through the pipeline. It detonated, and it complained about not having the right license key for a component that the malware author had used in his code. So the malware actually crashed trying to run. And then finally, last reason is profit. Everybody's putting together a malware pipeline. But you don't have to do it strictly for the reason of profit. Malware pipelines are ubiquitous enough now that for your own personal research, it's worthwhile, especially if you're looking at getting into threat intelligence or the InfoSec side. Which brings me to who uses a malware pipeline. It would surprise you. It used to be just McAfee or Norse, the usual suspects, people that are already in the information security game. But as time has rolled on, well, of course, information security and government had their own pipeline set up. Now, you'll find malware pipelines everywhere. You'll find it in retail, so stores like big box stores, department stores have their own malware pipelines set up. Banks have their own malware pipelines set up, specifically to combat what Jason mentioned earlier, CEOs opening up PDFs. Well, great example of a malware pipeline would be take all the attachments you see in email that are coming through, run them through the system that models all of your users' desktops. See if it does bad things to those desktops. If it does, you can immediately go back out and say, this person sent you a bad PDF, or I'm just going to strip it out of your email, or just something like that. Very easy win. Airlines use it. Airline manufacturers use it. And it's not just people with desktops. It's also people with physical hardware. The Internet of Things has actually created a good reason for people to run malware pipelines so that they can make sure that their firmware updates are valid, or firmware updates that they're getting from vendors are not going to blow up any of their devices. So, where does it all start? With a malware pipeline. Sources. We have to get the malware. Now, this is surprisingly really easy and hard at the same time. It's kind of like the spam thing. It's really easy to get spam, and it's also hard to get good spam. So there's two basic sources of malware, organic and synthetic. So the organic is malware that comes from active malicious sites. If you're a threat intelligence company, this is what you want. actively malicious sites that you can use as to go to your clients and say, I found this before everybody else, this is on my list, it's bad. Now, the problem with organic sources is that they expire very quickly. It's kind of like a spam email. In fact, a lot of malicious URLs, one source of them is through spam email. So website owners usually take down spam or malicious links as fast as they get put up. Honeypots are another source of organic malware. There's vendors of URL feeds of malware. In fact, I pulled up some examples of this. For example, Malshare is one site, and I'll show you the Docker example of pulling this out later. So URL feeds, PCAPs, like I said, if you're running a network sniffer on your, if you're a network admin, you're running some sort of sniffing utility, Snort for example, you can pull out all binaries and run that through your pipeline. If you happen to have access to the desktop that you're wanting, or the desktop systems behind you, or behind your, or within your network, you could install a utility there to pull memory snapshots out. So it was no accident that McAfee was one of the places that started with this, and there was others that had it at the time. But we would also get a feed of, whenever the client was running on the system, it would ask about certain unknown binaries, and it wouldn't send the whole file back, but it would just send the hash and say, is this good or bad? It's very basic. Well, that's been expanded upon in recent years to send back memory snapshots. There's in fact, there's a site that specializes in just this. How many of you are familiar with Virustotal? Virustotal is owned by Microsoft, and it's where the intrusion detection, or what is it? Basically, the AV system in Windows, built into Windows, sends the virus snapshots here. And they also open it up and they invite everybody else in the community to send virus snapshots here as well. But a lot of that will come from memory snapshots, so memory dumps. And then finally, I put down honey clients. Has anybody ever heard of the term honey client? Yeah? It's I think it's a relatively recent term. I haven't checked the Google Trends on it. But basically, malware doesn't want to be found. So there's many sources, these URLs, that won't let you download the malware until you basically authenticate that you're a real user. So mouse movements, screen size, different pieces of your browser have to identify as this is probably somebody who's really browsing the site versus an anonymous crawler. So because of that, there's at least two different Docker utilities I want to point out to you with this. One, and most of these utilities are going to come from a company called Remnux, or not really a company, but a group of. So hub.docker.com, this is assuming that you have it installed and you're running, and it's not that hard to get up and going. But once you get there, Remnux has several different containers that you can use. Two of them in particular, when it comes to sources, are Maltrieve, down here. Maltrieve actually has a list of sources inside of it that are actively updated by a community. And these are all free sources. You can just run it, and it'll go and grab all these pieces of actively malicious malware on live URLs. What that looks like, to give you an idea, is this. And let me blow this up so that you can actually see it. There we go. So, everybody see that okay? Blow it up a little bit more. So, this is, and this also shows some of the beauty of Docker. This is an entirely wrapped application. All the configuration, everything else is wrapped in this. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, and some of you came in a little bit later, but I have a, and I'll put it on the screen afterwards. I have a handout that has all of these links in it as well, so don't feel like you have to just rush to write it all down. Anyway, so this will probably set off a lot of alarm bells, but just running this command goes and grabs the Docker container from hub.docker.com, pulls it down, and starts running the Maltrieve client. Maltrieve, what I've done here, just a little bit of a Docker background, I've said go to my home/malwares directory and mount it into the Docker container. And what the Docker container will do is it'll go out and it's going and looking through all of those sources and seeing if it can find any that are actively malicious, download those binaries, and put them into my local directory under /malwares. Now I ran this earlier, so I've already got some data in here. Let's see, about 346 samples, so not a whole lot, but more than I thought that I would have. There we go. So, fresh malware samples from today from actively malicious links. So the second one that I wanted to show you, the second container, is something called Thug. So I mentioned honey clients earlier. Thug is basically, it emulates all kinds of different browsers and all kinds of different user behavior trying to elicit malware from these organic URLs. So simple, that's two components of a malware pipeline right there, is a honey client and a list of URLs to go and search. So crawling is usually the first bit. So finding sources, like I said, it's simple and it's hard at the same time, especially for organic. The next one is actually a lot easier. Synthetic. So synthetic feeds are from a vendor. There's lots of threat intelligence vendors out there. The space is actually pretty crowded right now. When I was putting all these together for Norse, we would actually go and contact a lot of these vendors, and surprisingly enough, the vendors, many of them will let you pull their feed if you're a private researcher. No, you don't have to pay them anything. The rationale is they want you to have confidence in their threat intelligence. And just as an aside, if they don't let you pull their feed, or at least give you a sample of it, then it's probably a warning sign. So synthetic malware, or synthetic feeds of malicious binaries, you usually get a ton more than you do from organic. The yield from organic is about 10 out of 1,000 or so, out of 1,000 URLs or 1,000 raw things. We had a yield calculation, and it never went over 20% of the raw data coming in versus the malware that we were coming out with. So synthetic, you get a lot more bang for your buck. Some sources for synthetic malware is a site called Virustotal. There's actually a lot of synthetic feeds, but Virustotal is one of the best. This is a project under Georgia Tech of just rolling up massive volumes of malware. All you have to do is email them and tell them that you're a private researcher, or if you're working with a corporation, they really don't mind. They just want to know who's using it. So you can kind of see here we're talking about really large volumes, 45 gigs, and these aren't shared, as you can imagine, by very many people. So it can take a while for them to be brought down. So yeah, I had to fight the network guys talking about the network stuff. I had to fight the network guys to actually have a server on the edge of the malicious network that I was already on to do the torrenting. And you can also see that the dates go back to 2012, and I'll tell you from having pulled these down, the virus samples inside of these could be even older than that. So another error that crops up in malware pipelines is malware is specifically written to run on certain systems. Malware doesn't have an installation program, so it assumes things about your environment. And a lot of times you'll have DLL errors that show up because malware is just assuming that the DLLs will be in certain places. Malware is also written specifically for certain versions of Windows. So in your pipeline, you have to understand that you're going to get a lot of malicious data that's not going to be targeted at any system that you have instrumented out. And you could spend a lot of time trying to make a very broad malware system, or you could target it to whatever environment you're looking to defend, such as your corporate network. Anyway, but if you're looking for archaeological data, you can get that here. But also, somewhere around in 2016, they started doing incremental updates a lot more regularly, right around February, where they'll do multiple drops per month of slightly smaller files, up to 10, 22 gigs, something like that. So they're a lot more digestible, and if you're going to build out a pipeline system that requires or that relies on this, I would encourage you to start at around 2016 to start adding those torrents. So this is just a huge dump of malicious binaries. Another thing I'll point out, most malware pipelines, you're dealing with live malicious data. I don't know if you guys saw, there was a sticker outside that was warning may contain cyber pathogens. That was a great sticker. It still cracks me up. But the idea is everything in the pipeline is actively malicious. Before you export it out to someone else, the general community practice is to encrypt the binaries with a password. Most of the time, the password is infected. So, just a thing to know if you're doing a pipeline that interacts with other people or outside interests. So, synthetic, some other things that we get from synthetic is that it's enriched. Enriched meaning that generally when you consume it from a third party, a threat intelligence vendor, they're going to tell you additional data about the malicious binary, such as they might tell you where they got it from. They might give you a hint of this is what we think it is as far as its classification. Some of them will include the Virustotal data. The very first thing that most people do is throw these binaries up to Virustotal. And Virustotal, or they'll either throw the binary up to Virustotal, or a more nice thing to do would be to throw the hash up to Virustotal and say, have you seen this? 9 times out of 10, they already have, and they'll have additional data like which virus scanners it ran under and some other behavior that it's seen or that they've seen. So, the enriched part also helps I cut this out, but I'm still going to throw it back in. It'll also help you down the line if you're adding this to a machine learning process. You can use the enriched part of it to kind of train your classifiers. And then finally, synthetic feeds are smooth. They go a lot more, that means there's a lot fewer things that are going to blow up your pipeline than an organic feed. Organic feeds, like I said, they fight back, so you have to fight them with honey clients and things like that. With all that data flowing in, and we got towards the end, we got to around 250,000 new samples coming in a day. But now we have to figure out how do we measure quality. So 250,000 samples sounds like a big deal, but a lot of those samples are just repackaged variations of the same piece of malware. And many of those are the same family or strain of malware that has been seen all over the place. Generally, you're going to try to find, or in your pipeline, what you're looking for is unique malware that hasn't been seen by anyone else. So, there's several quality control measures. Organic, what's the percentage of, or what's the distribution of URLs and IP addresses? Are they just giving you a feed of all, for example, there was one feed that we got where one person's WordPress site was compromised, and WordPress has this feature where it hijacks the URL rewriting system. So there was hundreds of thousands of URLs that were really just one file. It was the same exact file. So the poor guy, his site got rated by most AV vendors as the most malicious thing in the world, mostly because there was one file and he had a rewrite rule that redirected everything back to that one file. So, look at the diversity of the domains, the distribution, the unique number of binaries. First thing in a malware system is to figure out how you're going to cut out duplicates, because duplicates are all over the place. What we decided to do was base it off of the hash, the SHA-1 hash. And I think that's more of an industry standard now, either SHA-1 or MD5. Along those lines, speaking of synthetic, there is, from the Virustotal, a hash feed as well. Not just the torrent feed, but a hash feed. Hash feeds are still pretty hefty, but it's a lot less than downloading the multi-gigabyte. So if you're looking for, if you're doing research and you just want to find ransomware, you can figure out which one of these giant packages have ransomware. And actually, if you're doing more targeted research, at the very end of all this, there's some roll-ups that the Virustotal or the Virus Share guys have put together. So if you're doing Android malware or ELF, there's precious few Linux malware, or precious little Linux malware out there. The only thing fewer than Linux samples is Mac samples, even less. So CryptoLocker, I think, is their latest roll-up. So for the synthetic, so that's for the organic feeds, how you measure that. And there's actually a, for those of you who are into statistics or wanting to figure out how to properly vet this, there's a link in the handout to a system based in R to go and analyze the quality of certain feeds. And it basically uses this. What's the overlap? What's the percentage difference? Yeah. And it'll give you a good idea of what you hope to gain. A lot of these threat vendors, they overlap. So what we ended up doing is we would pull from the free sites first and then measure the vendors by how much they had as a delta difference from the free sites. So, synthetic feeds, what's their volume look like? Is it reliable? Valid binaries, I mentioned earlier that a lot of these, if you have an on-host system that'll pull out memory dumps, sometimes those memory dumps aren't valid, they're corrupted. So they may be sending you a malicious binary, which is a memory dump, but it's not executable. It's still useful for other things, but it's not as useful. So from there, we have our data coming in. We have our nice feed coming in. We're able to beat up these hosts and pull down binaries. Now, we want to take the data and refine it. And this is where a lot of the fun comes in. This is the mining part of data mining. So there's three parts of this that I've divided this into three different categories. If you're looking at a linear pipeline, the very first one, or the very first step, is a quick surface analysis. For those of you who are familiar with the Big O notation, that's an order of one operation. That's a quick byte lookup. No other dependencies. So this would also include hashing, generating a SHA-1 hash if you didn't have it already. And the testing the byte locations. This is effectively what, well, Yara can include non-O of 1 operations, but if you do just simple byte lookups, and a very quick win of a byte lookup is the magic numbers. So, magic numbers there we go. So, piping all these binaries through file to look at the magic numbers. Because in a pipeline, you're going to get a whole range of different types of files. And they can all be malicious, from PDFs to the most common, what you usually think of for malware is PE32 executables. That's the portable executable format for Windows. But you'll also find a lot of HTML. Does anybody know why you'll find a lot of HTML in malware, in a malware feed? Do what? exploit kits. So, mentioned it earlier, malware comes in 3 phases. At least typically 3 phases. There's the exploit that finds a vulnerability in some application or something that you're running. Then there's the dropper. Many of you, if you've ever seen an infestation take place, a dropper is the first binary that comes down, and its job is just to go out and find other pieces and pull those down. And then the final phase is the persistent threat. That's what ends up staying on your system and then replicating itself somewhere else. So HTML is typically the exploit. So any of you who are interested in like malicious JavaScript, the HTML will be what you'll be most interested in. For the typical reverse engineer, the PE32s are going to be interesting to you. It all depends on what your target of your malware pipeline is. And each one of those is its own special, unique category. PE32, which there's some really good books on that. Some Malware Analyst Cookbook. This deals heavily with, well, I think almost exclusively with PE32s. And then Practical Malware Analysis. Those would be PE32s. There's also some of these, like zips, that could be it gets kind of aggravating because those could be almost anything. It could be a Mac application. It could be a zip that's trying to get you to try to obfuscate itself from scanners on the network. Could be a number of different things. RAR files, that's definitely an attempt to evade detection. These empty files here, that's probably from Maltrieve earlier trying to get it from a host, and the host said, "You're not what I'm thinking." So, I don't think, probably not going to find anything else. Some of the most interesting ones that I've found are like XML. So, IE for a long time had a bug in its XML parser that allowed, it was a quick pipeline for malware to be executed from. So XML most likely is pulling out that exploit. Yeah, we're probably not going to find any macho binaries in this. They're really, really rare. For all of the binaries that we downloaded in 2015, I had about 300 for Mac. And that was actually a 200% increase over the last year. So, by far, the most popular form of malware is PE32s. So, surface analysis, very quick, byte locations, MIME types, hashing. There should be no dependencies in the surface analysis. The idea here is as you flow through the pipeline, you want to cut out as much fat as possible. So, if you're not interested in PDFs, or if you're not interested in PE32s, chuck those out in the beginning. The next thing is static analysis. Static analysis is where we do everything up to actually executing the code. Static analysis, I believe, is where you get the most scale. It's not the sexiest one, we'll get to that in a second, but it is where a lot of data comes from. So static analysis is greater than an order of 1 operation. That is, you're not just doing simple byte lookups, but it's not an exponential operation where you're actually running the malware and it could take an indefinite amount of time to come back. So what we are usually looking for here, and I'll use PE32 as an example, you're looking at the different, so a PE32 file has a well-defined header. And there's different ranges of bytes and all this information in it. So we're looking for checksums whether or not the file is what it declares itself to be. So a PE32 file should have a checksum that says this is my contents. A very simple way to find out or to detect malware is that its checksum usually doesn't match because the malware is trying to fool the system into either giving it too much memory or too little so that it can escape that. Entropy calculations. Malware tries to encrypt itself most of the time. So if a file has a high degree of entropy, especially relative to other files that you see. That's a quick indication that it's probably malware as well. And the type of entropy will give you a good clue as to what category it fits in, so you can kind of fit these clues together. Checksum, or the header for PE32 also includes information like what it was compiled with, what year it was compiled with, what language it was compiled under. Some of you may remember the Sony exploit from, I guess, 2 years ago now, and they used some of that header information to conclude that it probably came from North Korea. There's also in the most recent black energy malware, there was header information that indicated that there was several different types. So malware vendors actually sell pieces of malware to themselves. So, like for example, this piece of malware is to defeat this specific antivirus or this firewall or something like that. So in the surface analysis, in the static analysis, you can find that information out. This actually came from, so for example, the black energy, they were able to identify that there's 4 different modules that were in it, and some of the strains, from different vendors that were already well known. So programmatic debugging is another static analysis step. Programmatic debugging is where, actually there's a really good book on that too. Gray Hat Python. Sorry about the spelling. So Gray Hat Python, if anybody's interested in static or programmatic debugging, Justin in this book goes step by step through creating a programmatic debugger in Python. And remember, the name of the game for a malware pipeline is automation. So you'll probably it will benefit you to do malware analysis manually in order to understand what we're doing with the programmatic debugging. Malware, like I said, tries to hide itself as much as possible. This is done through a process called packing. Installers are packers. You pack a bunch of different files into one file, and then you execute that file, and it goes through, and it unpacks everything in it. So a pack, you can think of this as the installation process of malware. And this is actually where a lot of malware starts fighting back, even at the static analysis step, where another hot field in malware analysis is vendors that provide unpacking for a range of different vendors that malware uses. So if it was just as simple as unzipping the malware, anybody could open it. But malware authors tend to prefer things like encrypted packer systems that load themselves into memory and then perform a cryptographic function to pull the files out, so that we can't just do a static analysis and say, here's all the files that are in it. Well, there's actually several vendors that do specialize in unpacking. And just to give you an idea, Reversing Labs is a commercial vendor that we used at Norse. They provided a pretty good range of unpackers. Now, this isn't open source. There are some open source utilities for unpackers. We'll get into that in just a second. So another static analysis would be features, or would be heuristic evaluation through YARA rules. Using other vendors, most threat intelligence actually provides a feed of YARA rules as well. Many of them do. Make sure I'm doing good on time. All right. So some other more exotic things, well, not exotic, opcodes for executable files. How many of you are familiar with assembly and any of that stuff? So opcodes are where we pull out the operation instructions from the malware. And this is actually almost, the specific opcodes are platform specific, but the idea of just pulling out opcodes in general as features is pretty platform independent. So you can do this same technique on Macho binaries for Mac, or ELF binaries for Windows, or PE binaries. So I should have actually moved that up. The more exotic ones are to generate an abstract syntax tree, which is what you generate off of the opcodes. How many of you have ever used IDA Pro? IDA Pro is a really good professional disassembler utility. What it does for you is the very basic of it. You open a PE file, and it will try to group all these opcodes together and try to show you with a nice graph where the execution flow goes. Generating an abstract syntax tree programmatically is actually pretty hard, but it's really useful. And the idea there is, if I've got two files and they have a similar execution flow, then I can kind of group those together. It also gives me an idea of how a file goes about mutating things on the host operating system, changing registry keys, or the hot one now is ransomware. So the opcode graph for beginning to encrypt all the data on a hard drive. Last one, which I find is some of the most fun, is actually patching the execution flow for malware. Most malware today will try to detect if you are running it in a sandbox environment and short-circuit itself and not run anymore. So patching the malware, and there's actually some good papers on that, again, links in the handout, of taking the opcodes, and it's basically just a genetic algorithm to see if it changes the bytes, if it fuzzes it. And fuzzing is where you, well, I'll get into that in a second. But basically, we're changing the bytes to see how far in the execution code we can get in the malware. We want to execute as much of it as possible. So using a combination of programmatic debugging and generating an abstract syntax tree, and this whole part right here is actually where entire companies have been built. But patching the malware so that it will run to completion, so that it won't, a good way to defeat most malware pipelines is to execute, pause and wait for 30 minutes or so, and then begin your execution. The reason for that is, as a malware pipeline engineer, I want to put as much malware through my pipeline as possible. As a malware author, I want to be detected by as few people as possible. So I'm going to do everything I can to throw a wrench into those plans. So static analysis, a good static analysis tool. Let me get back to my notes. Again, using Remnux's library, there's actually two that I got to run real quick. So Radar 2. Radar is a static analysis framework. So if I take and this is running Radar, and I'm attaching it again. There you go. If I'm attaching it to the same directory that I downloaded all those samples into, and I'm running a bash command, this is inside of the Radar container. For a full automated pipeline, I wouldn't stop at a bash prompt, but I wanted to show you the steps that are involved. So here's all the files that I just downloaded. There we go. Pulling out just some of the PE32s to run this analysis over. So Radar 2, sorry, I ran this earlier and I forgot the syntax. There we go. So Radar 2, this is a programmatic debugging client. I'm not sure what it's related. I think it might be something that's related to what was mentioned in the book that I just pointed out earlier. But basically, we're taking the file and we're doing some real simple static analysis in this part. This can actually get a lot more elaborate. Radar has support for a bunch of other like macros, and it's basically the Metasploit of malware. So in this example, we're running it over a surface analysis, looking at the type, the EDN values, machine architecture, what it's some of the features that I was pointing out earlier. And Radar actually adds in some plugins. There's a whole host of plugins to use. These two in particular, the canary is it trying to detect that it's being run in a sandbox, which if that's true, it just means that you're probably going to have to go through a bunch of other steps to get it to give you its secrets. Whether it's using crypto, and I forget what the NX flag is. Anyway, so all of this is really good data to throw back into your pipeline. This is the enriched data that we're after, some of the enriched data. We're actually looking at getting a lot more. So another utility that we could use is PE Scanner. Now, static analysis utilities, there's a ton of them out there. And each one is its own suite of utilities to use on a piece of malware. If you've never taken, so this PE Scanner, the information it pulls out is, let's come back up. We could probably get this more interestingly as a JSON file. That would be what I would look for as a pipeline engineer, but this is more readable. So the metadata that we saw with Radar, interesting instruction offsets. That would be useful for putting together a call tree, call graph. Version information. So, like I said, some of the PE file header details show you where it's been, what it's been compiled on. So this would be, well, there's product information for the file itself, and then there's, this is for the file itself. Section information, and this suspicious is generated by a pattern matching system inside of PE Scanner itself. Some of the things that make a file suspicious is that it will only import 1 or 2 DLLs. Most commercial software would import all of that, and they're not trying to hide it. Malware will import 1 or 2 DLLs as a very bare minimum, and then it'll make assumptions about where it can load all the other DLLs dynamically. So a good programmatic debugger will pick that activity up. Resources, it's pretty common now for malware to try to attach itself to really large binaries to throw this off. So for example, Steam, you have a good 4 gig game file. You attach a small binary to the end of it, and then the entire thing gets marked as malicious by the rest of the malware community, but it's really just this one file that's added into the packer. So resources will help you kind of cut through that chaff. If it's an icon, probably, I don't know, there could be some exploits in the icon handling stuff, so there were in Windows for a while. Typically not that much. Some of these others are interesting for reverse engineers creating more pipeline components, like dialogues. If there's 5 dialogues in this file, then there's potentially 5 different screens that I'm going to have to try to programmatically interact with. Imports, like I said, malware tries to import as little as possible. And then you have the actual library calls that were noticed in the file. Now, these are all large amounts of data, and what you would do in a pipeline is you would throw all of this into a large data set like Elasticsearch. You would have the hash, and you would decorate it with all this information that you've seen. And then you would have a process to run over Elasticsearch, or whatever that source of truth is, and generate more intelligence based on this raw data that you found, features. So the last feature generation method, and arguably the sexiest, is dynamic execution. The most popular dynamic execution, and I apologize I didn't have my guest VM set up, so I'll just describe it to you instead of showing it. But the the most popular malware, dynamic malware execution system is called Cuckoo. Cuckoo, and I love the fact that somebody went and wrapped it all up into a nice Docker container, because setting Cuckoo up by itself was a pain in the butt. It really was. I wasted a whole month just on this. You guys are laughing. You probably have experienced it. So setting up Cuckoo is a pain. What it is, the reason why it's a pain is we have what we're doing with dynamic analysis. We're taking a malicious binary, we're injecting it into a clean virtual machine or hardware. We'll get to that in a second. You're injecting that malicious binary into an execution environment, and then you're observing what it does. Just let it run free. And then you're looking to see, does it call out to any host? Does it try to mutate the system? Does it try to change registry keys or drop additional files? If it's a dropper, does it, what other malicious files does it pull in? All that stuff. It's really fun to watch. It's, like I said, it's a pain to set up. The speed of processing is pretty variable, but it's not going to be anywhere close to static analysis. That said, it is one of the hottest things, and it does, because of the way that virus authors can encrypt their files, encrypt their execution pipelines, we're probably never going to get away from having to use dynamic analysis on malware. At McAfee, there was talk about setting up, huge clusters of machines that were just Windows clients and doing the same thing that Cuckoo did. But actually, theirs was before Cuckoo. So anyway. So there's at least two different types of dynamic analysis environments. Virtual, so typical use case for Cuckoo would be to have a Windows guest operating system that you've set up in VMware, and that's what we ended up doing. Well, actually, ours was in VirtualBox. You could use it in VMware or VirtualBox. There's reasons to prefer one over the other. And you have a snapshot of a clean state. And the way that Cuckoo will work is it will reset to the clean state, inject the malware, run it, observe all the network connections, and then shut it down, and then the next sample comes through, resets to the clean state. And that sounds really nice and simple, but in practice, malware does all kinds of bad things to guest operating systems. So what you end up having to do is having snapshots of your snapshots and shuffle all that around. Another way to use a sandbox or to dynamically execute files is through actually having a physical device. Last year we ran into a case where a client had a malicious binary that inserted itself into the GPU. Most virtual machines aren't going to have a GPU available. So we had to actually stand up a physical box, and to snapshot a physical box, you use something called like deep freeze or some other freezing application. The idea is you want to set it back to a clean space. This is also where I get pretty excited about Docker. It doesn't exist right now, but it's on their roadmap. They're looking to support ARM execution. If they support ARM execution in Docker containers, then that means that we can do dynamic analysis for the Internet of Things, which is going to be like Raspberry Pis and all those types of devices in Docker. Another dynamic analysis environment is to use, so a hypervisor is just something that runs another system underneath it. Hypervisor examples would be like Wine. Does anybody remember Wine? Yeah? So zero Wine, and this isn't Dockerized yet. I say yet. I had it before. So zero Wine is an alternative to Cuckoo. Cuckoo is arguably more advanced, but zero Wine is still out there. And the idea is to use, it uses QEMU under the hood, but the idea is to wrap the entire dynamic analysis up into one system. Whereas with Cuckoo, you have the Cuckoo system, and then it has to be told about the guest virtual machines that it can use and abuse. Another example, there was one more. Wine would be kind of in the middle. Anyway, on the hot field here is writing your own hypervisors. So malware knows when it's being run on VMware or VirtualBox. There's a system called Red Pill that's used as the benchmark, or not Red Pill, PA-Fish, and again, in the handouts. But the gold standard for whether or not you're running a good dynamic analysis system is this executable called PA-Fish. PA-Fish is, am I running in a virtualized environment? Not all malware shuts itself down now if it's running in a virtualized environment because of the rise of things like Azure and people using just cloud-based systems. It's still valid to infect those. So it's not just automated malware pipelines that are looking for this stuff. But if your system fails miserably at PA-Fish, and there's a really good BSides DC talk from last year, the end of last year, about some researchers that created a non-malicious binary and submitted it to Virustotal. It wasn't malicious, but it had malicious type activity, and that got flagged by all the malware vendors. And one of the things they found out about it is a lot of these malware pipeline systems look very similar to each other. So it would be trivially easy for malware authors to know if they're being run by malware hunters. That's more of an industry thing than anything else. So, environments matter. Like I said, malware looks for a specific type of environment. So for dynamic analysis, you're probably going to have to mock out all of the target environments that you're interested in. Windows 7, XP, 10, since it just forced its way onto some people's systems. The problem, though, with dynamic analysis that you're going to run into in any pipeline, this is the bottleneck for every pipeline. It is exponential. It is every bad thing about computation that you can imagine. Because any malware has any number of operations that it will perform. So what ends up happening is, for most pipelines, they'll restrict the execution time to 5 minutes. Like I said earlier, easy way to defeat that is just wait it out. So some vendors, for their dynamic analysis, have started doing things like time warping. So we start the analysis, and in the system clock, we start, jumping forward by leaps and bounds in time, so that by the end of the execution, as far as the malware knows, it's 20 years into the future. Something like that. That kind of defeats the I'll just wait them out. But now, another common, or a simple tactic is just the malware will ask you to install it. Human interaction. Remember, as a malware author, I want to know that I'm hitting a valuable system. So there is actually a lot of malware that will stop and refuse to do anything until you've interacted with it. So if you're talking to your friends and family, one thing that I've told my parents a lot is you're not infected just because the malware asked you to do something. Not necessarily. So, environment matters. So there's also another hot area on this. A company called VMware is pretty good about this. And their system is not open sourced either, but they actually have an entire scripted framework. If you see this dialog, click this button. So I'm being told that I'm running out of time or all the way out of time. Am I all the way out of time? One minute? Oh, I'm sorry. I wanted to. All right, I'll stop and let anybody ask questions for a little bit. Yes, sir. Yeah, sorry about that. Here's the handout. The Owly link at the bottom here. And if you, I'll tweet out that link too at the end of here. So anybody who's watching the BSides Nashville Twitter feed, I'll send that out as well. And I'm sorry I didn't get to the rest of the slides. Basically, the end of it is just using it in a machine learning context. Hence why I cut that whole section out. So, any other questions real quick? Yes?
So, you made a comment on this, but, if the bad guys understand the pipeline, you said trivial. I assume you were talking about whether or not, detecting whether or not
yeah.
pipeline. Well, what about just avoiding it entirely? Does that happen very often?
Well, avoiding it entirely would be avoiding getting into the source, or getting into the sources part of the pipeline. Right. So yeah, they try to avoid that. They won't let you download from organic sources unless you verify that who you are.
Right. Like as an example, we saw, the P32 Zeus samples we were getting.
Mm-hmm.
This was just on the enterprise side. I'm never been a malware researcher. We had FireEye and all this stuff in line. They started just packing them into Java jars.
Mm-hmm.
And the only purpose of the Java jar was to create the P32 file. Once it got on the endpoint, past all the network stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing was really set up to look at Java files at all.
Yeah.
Analyze it. So it seems to me like that would avoid getting into the pipeline in the first place.
Well, the jar would get into the pipeline, and then your job there is to take the static analysis and pull the PE32 out of the jar. So.
Right. And it was like 10 class files and obfuscated and all that. And
yeah.
Yeah, so you'd have to actually run the jar.
Yep, that would be the dynamic.
Okay, so.
Yep, that would be the dynamic analysis. So thank you guys for attending, and if you have any questions or anything, feel free to email me, and thanks guys, it's great.
I enjoyed your comment about human interaction. I